So many of the major SEND reform proposals appear in sections that don't have any questions attached to them. So if you only look at the questions, you will miss some of the most significant changes they're proposing. We're going to go through the key ones now because it's vital context for the final question, which asks for any other comments. I would make some notes while watching this video so you know where you personally would like to focus. First, data and technology, pages 34 to 35. They describe building a safe, evidence-based, digital and data-driven approach to supporting SEND, including individual support plans. This section talks about integrated systems, shared records, digital plans, assistive technology lending libraries, increased data sharing and greater use of AI to improve learning, reduce teacher workload and make systems run more efficiently. They mention the need for safety. There are no direct questions asking families how comfortable they are with data sharing, how AI should be used, or what safeguards should exist. Next up is reasonable adjustments on pages 41 to 42. They say they will support inclusion by strengthening the use of available guidance on reasonable adjustments. They will ask the Equality and Human Rights Commission to strengthen the technical guidance for schools. They also say children should not need a diagnosis to receive reasonable adjustments, which is very true and often forgotten. Examples they give include uniform adjustments and access to adapted learning materials. I don't think this goes far enough. We know many settings refuse to make easy, zero-cost adjustments to things like uniform for no good reason, so I would add specific monitoring and accountability here. Then we have effective curriculum delivery and adaptations, page 49. They say they will create a new world-leading school curriculum that raises standards and supports aspirations for all children. They also talk about evidence-based curriculum adaptations, reviewing curriculum flexibility, and adapting teaching for pupils with SEND. Again, this is huge expectations placed on mainstream schools with no mention of the increased pressures they will have under these plans. There's a transition section on page 50 and there is a question about post-16 transitions, but none on moving from early years to school, which is one of the hardest transitions for many with SEND. They will fund new partnerships between early year settings and schools, help children and parents build relationships with schools, provide new reception teacher training and continue early intervention programs. There's not much information there really. Then educational psychologists and speech and language therapists on pages 60 to 61. As I mentioned when we discussed the experts at hand section, they will invest over £40 million over 3 years to train 200 more educational psychologists per year and expand speech and language therapy support. They talk about statutory assessments being too time consuming and they say educational psychologists spent an average of 17 hours on a single EHCP, and they frame this as bureaucracy instead of it being evidence of just how in-depth the current needs assessment process is, something that would be lost for many children under this proposed system. The section suggests educational psychologists would have more time to work directly with children, but that directly contradicts what they say in the experts at hand section, where they acknowledge that specialists will initially advise schools and upskill staff. It said they may be able to provide bespoke advice or conduct small group interventions in future. That is incredibly limited access to expertise compared to what we have now, especially when it's used to justify limiting EHCPs. They also say there'll be more speech and language support workers and one advanced speech and language practitioner per ICB area. But they don't mention ICBs are currently merging, so one practitioner could potentially have to cover multiple counties and a vast number of local authorities. They highlight speech and language apprenticeships doubled their intake last year, but that increase was from 50 to 100. It's a drop in the ocean. Where are the incentives and bursaries needed for these professionals? Then transitioning to the new system on pages 72 to 73, this section is incredibly important. It explains how children with EHCPs would gradually move into the new system, and there's no questions on it. New legislation is not expected before September 2029, but even that seems like an ambitious timeline to me. Children with EHCPs in 2029 would gradually be assessed against the new system at transition points like primary to secondary or secondary to post-16. Some would move to specialist provision packages, would be given new EHCPs, as well as individual support plans setting out their day-to-day provision. Others would lose their EHCP and only have an individual support plan with support from the experts at hand service at best. They say many more needs will be met with the universal offer and targeted layer without an EHCP. In terms of timelines, they say children who are in mainstream settings when the law is changed would retain their EHCP and provision until they complete their current phase of education, primary, secondary or post-16. It says all children and young people who have a special school place in September 2029 will be able to stay in special school until the end of their education unless they choose to move to a mainstream setting. Their EHCP and support will continue to be reviewed annually. Now, when I met with Georgia Gould, I asked specifically what would happen to children who lose their EHCP, because surely they would not be able to stay in a specialist school. She did provide clarification, and I asked if I could share it. She said it would be better for her to provide a written response that I could share to back up what I was saying. Unfortunately, I have not received this yet, although I am told it is coming. I don't want to share the information in case their position has changed and it gives false information, but if I do receive it, I will of course share it with you right away. There's a section on the specialist sector, pages 74 to 77. They describe these reforms as a fundamental reset for the specialist sector, which is an understatement. So they say specialist settings will be treated as centres of excellence with increasing responsibility to provide outreach, share expertise with and support mainstream settings, offer more part-time or short-term placements. Then we get to the misleading language. They say by 2035, the proportion of children in specialist provision is expected to rise, but around a quarter of those children would be in specialist places in mainstream schools. Their insistence on using the term specialist places to describe places in mainstream schools still feels deliberately misleading to me. Then early years funding, pages 95 to 96. Local authorities will get inclusive early years funding to distribute to early years providers from 2026 to 27. And then from 2029, they will rebalance high needs funding so that more of it goes to early years settings. However, they explicitly say this will reduce reliance on individual assessments, which is frankly a terrible idea. Effective early intervention requires proper assessment of individual needs. That is a challenge in early years, even with individual assessment. If we fail to identify needs correctly or get the provision wrong, early intervention becomes a waste of time, money, and a child's potential. It is such a false economy. Finally, the accountability section on pages 97 to 102, which mentions almost no accountability mechanisms. Accountability is always top of parents' list when it comes to reforms, so they've used the word a lot but haven't actually explained any consequences for failing children. The consultation says settings will become responsible for delivering educational provision rather than local authorities, but it's clear from the document that the contents of individual support plans wouldn't be legally enforceable. If parents disagree with the contents of an individual support plan set by a school, their only recourse is through the complaints process of the school that wrote the plan. Where is the accountability in that? There's lots of talk of oversight and Ofsted, but nothing on actual consequences for settings. Even if there were, systems under pressure will be limited to delivering what they are legally required to provide. That is one of the major reasons EHCPs have become so important in the current system. This section also contains huge new expectations for governors and trust boards to scrutinise inclusion and the quality of ISPs. They say there will be new guidance and training for governors, but I wonder how many governors will be willing or able to carry this out. I also want to point out it says there will be new guidance on how healthcare professionals can delegate healthcare tasks to school staff. It says this guidance will seek to confirm the responsibility and accountability for the delivery of healthcare-related tasks when delegated to staff in schools. The extent of the expectations placed on teachers and support staff within this document is mind-blowing, but I expect this will be especially worrying for schools. And just a reminder that the resolution and legal framework section sets out significant reductions in appeal rights and tribunal powers, and there's not a single question on this, but there's more on that in part 17 of this series. Next we'll come to question 39, the final one, where they ask if there's anything else to contribute. We'll talk about the judicial review against this consultation. We'll look at what we should include in the answer to this question, given how few of the questions address our actual concerns. There's also a strict character limit, so we will talk about strategies on how to answer the final question in my next video. If you would like to see the previous videos in this series, you can find them all on my page. They're all uploaded in order on my YouTube playlist, which is linked in my bio.